Hey, I'm Stina. Today in this vlog, we're going to be discussing the events that occurred in 1968. In order to understand what happened in France, we have to examine the political ideology and beliefs that created such civil unrest. Karl Marx is widely regarded as the father of communism. He and his co-author, Friedrich Engels, contributed much to the social and political ideology of revolutionary ideas that opposed the capitalist economy. In his well-known pamphlet, The Communist Manifesto, and other works such as his economic theory, Das Kapital, Marx outlines the theory of communism. Marx writes about the unequal distribution of resources and division in income wealth that has been created by centuries of generational resource accumulation and lucky circumstances. This has contributed to a form of slave wages, where capitalists profit from the surplus revenue created by the labor of the working class. Workers get paid a low wage to sustain living, while owners get to experience greater leisure at the expense of others. Workers have no control of the profits of the fruit of their labor, while the owners are at great advantage. In 1848, Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto. In this pamphlet, they advocate for the uprising and empowerment of the working class, the proletariat, or the majority of the population. Together, they highlight previous generations' accumulation and hoarding of wealth at the expense of others. The theory of communism asserts and predicates the history of class struggle to be the direct cause of the majority of wealth on earth being consolidated into the hands of a few. The manifesto calls and predicts a revolutionary uprising of the proletariat and putting an end to satisfying the needs of the bourgeoisie. In terms of present day, we can clearly see the division of wealth all over the world. In the United States, for example, it is common knowledge that 20% of the country's population owns 93% of the currency, while the remaining 80% of the population has to share 7% of the national wealth. Capitalism favors these few families over everyone else. Marx believes a socialist revolution will be the precursor to a communist state. Famous quotes was, "The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite." One of Marx's more famous works, his economic theory discussing the downfalls and negative connotations of capitalism, is Das Kapital. This paper highlights the destructive nature of capitalism. Das Kapital explains that capitalism is a failing economic system that is exploiting and manipulating the workers who are fueling it. The capitalist class becomes unfit to rule because it is incompetent to ensure an existence to its slaves within slavery. Communist ideology emphasizes radical and socialist ideals, especially during this time period in 1968, advocating and empowering low-income earners. Okay, but what does it mean to be a Marxist? Marxism is an ideology that provides and explains the framework to achieving a communist society. A communist society is a political state in which the means of productions are controlled by the overall community rather than individuals or private business owners. Wealth and resources are divided based on contribution and need. A Marxist would advocate for the dissolution of class structures, rejecting capitalism and private business ownership, advocating for social welfare programs, and abolishing religion in terms of the state. Now back to 1968, where the flames of this ideology began to spark revolutions throughout France. Leading up to the events throughout May, over at Paris University in Nanterre, student-led protests aimed to shed light on the arrests of fellow academics following the protest of Vietnam. A history of strikes and ideas of uprising was ideologically aligned with the growing left and stemmed from the works of Karl Marx. Over 150 students occupied a university room and only vacated following the release of their peers. This has been regarded as the precursor for the following events that unfolded. What is referred to in France as May 68 began at the University of Paris as another student-led protest on the 2nd of May. Young students had a growing disdain for an outdated education system, an authoritarian and Napoleonic university system, and lack of employment opportunities. France was in a period of repression, with poorly funded public services and education. This growing dislike for the current system led to an uprising of over 10 million students and members of the working class. The effects of this revolution halted the French economy and even forced the sitting president, Charles de Gaulle, to flee France. The University of Paris closed down, following months of clashes between students and authorities. On the 3rd of May, the campus's closure resulted in the students moving ongoing protests to the Latin Quarter called Sorbonne. Students protested the school closure, occupied buildings, led strikes against growing imperialism, and for rights such as visiting the dorms of opposite sexes. This resulted in violent conflicts with authorities and led to the arrest of over 550 students. Workers, teachers, and other civilians found affinity with the student revolts and began to join the growing movement of civil unrest. May 6, 1968. Authorities violently responded to protesters. Tear gas was deployed and strikers were beaten. Hundreds of people were left injured. This sparked national outrage. Workers wanted increased pay and improved conditions. What began in an educational institution sparked a chain of general strikes throughout the country, affecting factories and industries and nearly collapsing the economy. This closed down newspaper distribution, 2 major railroads, and airports. On the 9th of May, students, workers, revolutionaries from France, Germany, Spain, and Italy met to continue and sustain the current fight for change. On this day, those party to the event denounced growing imperialism, the economic system of capitalism, and the bourgeoisie culture. Following 2 months of public protest, civil upheaval, and a collapsing government, nearly 10 million workers were on strike. That was 2/3 of the French workforce. This resulted in freezing the economy. On the night of May 10th, students set up barricades and rioted in the Latin Quarter. Nearly 400 people were hospitalized, more than half of them police. Leftist students began calling for radical economic and political change in France, and union leaders planned strikes in support of the students.
I was looking down there, and it was the night already, and all these barricades were up, and the police was behind, and it was very dramatic because we didn't know what was going to happen. And suddenly there was a huge light. It was a cocktail Molotov or something like that, which suddenly burst there, and that was the start of the police charge. And there we are, and they were all around us. We were surrounded by sort of grenades, I don't know what things flying to us, and I got one on the feet, I remember very well, and this awful smell of sort of chemicals trying to make us cry or things like that. It was very frightening because it was the night. And you had quite a lot of wounded people, and I remember very well there was a very famous one of our Nobel Prize, Mr. Monod. He was trying to help the people to go to hospital and things like that. So in the end we had to retreat and leave. So I was lucky enough to to escape and go back in the night.
In addition to the framework laid by Karl Marx, there was also a relatively new school of thought that had become of interest in the intellectual community. The Situationist International distinguished itself with its unique blend of political and artistic theory. Its political ideas drew heavily from Marxism. They championed or expounded upon Marx's idea of capitalism's alienating power. Central to their theory was the idea of the spectacle. In his book, The Society of the Spectacle, Guy Debord attempted to explain the notion of the spectacle when he wrote, "Understood in its totality, the spectacle is both the outcome and the goal of the dominant mode of production. It is the very heart of society's real unreality. In all of its specific manifestations, news or propaganda, advertising or the actual consumption of entertainment, the spectacle epitomizes the prevailing model of social life. It is the omnipresent celebration of a choice already made in the sphere of production, and the consummate result of the choice. In form, as in context, the spectacle serves as total justification for the conditions and aims of the existing system. It further ensures the permanent presence of that justification, for it governs almost all time spent outside the production process itself." The spectacle was a dominating force. It could not be escaped from within bounds of capitalism. This was because all of the institutions that existed within capitalism propagated for its continuation in order to ensure their continued existence. Students from the Sorbonne College reached out to the Situationist International group for help in constructing a declaration and writing that would properly convey their concerns. A situationist, Maya Kayati, wrote a pamphlet called On the Poverty of Student Life, which critiqued the failing university system. Modern capitalism and its spectacle allot everyone a specific role in a general passivity. The student is no exception to the rule. He has a provisional part to play, a rehearsal for his final role as an element in market society as conservative as the rest. Being a student is a form of initiation, an initiation which echoes the rites of more primitive societies with bizarre precision. It goes on outside of history, cut off from social reality. The student leads a double life, poised between his present status and his future role. The two are absolutely separate, and the journey from one to other is a mechanical event in the future. Meanwhile, he basks in a schizophrenic consciousness, withdrawing into his initiation group to hide from that future. Protected from history, the present is a mystic trance. This pamphlet encouraged student rebellion by disseminating situationist ideology. Explaining and expanding on the unfair and looked down upon role of students in society, this only further precipitated the protests of May 1968. The Confédération Générale du Travail was the General Confederation of Labor. This was the national trade union in France in 1968. They promoted resourceful bargaining and striking. They also encouraged protests among students and workers in response to police brutality that was demonstrated on May 11th. The future French Communist Party General Secretary, Georges Marquet, wrote an article called False Revolutionaries to be Unmasked. He called the students mostly sons of the grand bourgeois, contemptuous towards the students of working-class origin. They would quickly snuff out their revolutionary flames to become director in Papa's business. According to the French Communist Party, the student protest movement was an entire ultra-left, petty bourgeois cocktail of Bakunin, Trotskyism, and plain adventurism. The reality was rather different. The lies of the French Communist Party propagated, including that the students were funded by the government, were part of the French Communist Party's attempt to delegitimize a movement over which it had no control. In response to the uncharacteristic actions of the French Communist Party in the 1960s, Kenneth Libby wrote an ideological profile. The Marxist conception of legitimacy has been evident since Lenin disbanded the Constituent Assembly in 1918 and asserted the higher law of revolution. It depends on the substance rather than the process. Government is legitimate if it represents the truest interest of the masses. If it is moving society towards its proper goals, it is from this perspective that the Gaullist regime is subjected to unyielding attack. Gaullist policies are consistently explained as favoritism to monopoly, capitalism. The Gaullist regime rose to power following a civil war. This republican-based authority acts as a puppet for powerful forces, favoring private businesses, providing tax breaks, and subsidizing industries. They allowed prices to rise by inflating profits and devaluing currency. Although by Western standards, French industry is often portrayed as fragmented and small in scale to the PCF. Its principal features are concentration and domination by monopolistic firms. This was foreseen by Marx as the final stage of a capitalistic development before the system was overturned by revolution. The proletariat goes through various stages of development. With its birth begins its struggle with the bourgeois. At the first, the contest is carried on by the individual laborers, then the work people of a factory, then by the operative of one trade, in one locality, against the individual bourgeois who directly exploits them. They direct their attacks not against the bourgeois conditions of production, but against the instruments of production themselves. They destroy imported wares that compete with their labor. They smash to pieces machinery. They set factories ablaze. They seek to restore by the force the vanished status of the workmen of the Middle Ages. This organization of the proletarians into a class, and consequently into a political party, is continually being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves. But it ever rises up again, stronger, firmer, mightier. It compels legislative recognition of particular interests of the workers by taking advantage the divisions among the bourgeois itself. The French Communist Party was clearly not aligned with empowering the worker, but rather politically motivated and furthering the continuing system of oppression. Attempting to talk down and prevent students and worker protest is directly oppressing the desires and concerns of the very people the party advocates for. It's been said that the revolution of 1968 failed, but it was a failure that changed the world. On May 27, 1968, President de Gaulle negotiates with trade unions to create the Grenelle Agreements. This agreement guarantees worker rights, along with improved conditions and an increase in wages. On May 30, 1968, about 500,000 workers called for the abdication of President de Gaulle. In response, de Gaulle threatens to declare a state of emergency if the workers on strike don't return to their jobs and announces an election on June 23rd. De Gaulle wins the majority of votes during election and remains president on June 23, 1968. April 29, 1968, de Gaulle's new authority is put up to a referendum, and he loses. A new president is elected in France, Georges Pompidou. All in all, the Communist Party and the Situationist International aided students and workers all throughout France to unite together and rebel against the current state. These political ideologies played a massive role in inspiring young people throughout the world to band together and protest against unfair systems of government.